Hello, I've got an unusual book for me to read, which I want to tell you about this week. Anthony Blunt, His Lies by Miranda Carter. And I'm reading this book specifically for the fact that it's been a reading ongoing readathon this month called Dr. November, and it's based on spies and so forth. And I went looking in the library for books on spies, came across this and thought it ticks a couple of boxes. He's pretty well known as having been a leading light in the art world. I opened the book and he mentioned a couple of my favourite poets, W.H. Auden and Louis MacNeice. He actually shared a study with Louis MacNeice in his final year at secondary school. And I thought, this could be interesting. Anthony Blunt is pretty famous for being the fourth man in the Cambridge ring of spies that was gradually uncovered after the Second World War. And he was also had another life, as the title says, His Lives. He had another life as a really well-known art critic, and he headed up the Courtauld Institute, which taught in art history. He was very fundamental in setting up their courses and writing about art history. And he was also keeper of the Queen's pictures, which meant that he was dealing with the royal family's pictures and paintings and occasionally met them. So he was moving in royal circles, which caused much of the stir whenever he was revealed to be someone who was spying and passing on secrets from Britain to Russia. Since I'm talking about the spy book, maybe I should proceed along the lines of questions. You know why I was reading it? Why did the author write it? Well, I came across a YouTube video where she's interviewed and she explained that there was a personal connection. So her book is written in 2001, and in the prologue she points out that it's a specific time and place. There's been some more information coming out about him for several reasons. One is that former colleagues have made their peace with his behaviour because he's been outed over. He died in 1983, so he was outed as a spy in 1979, officially, very, very publicly. So they'd had time to process their feelings. Also, attitudes to being gay had changed greatly, and there was now more openness, and that side of his life could now be talked about more easily by those who knew him. And also the end of the Cold War. That freed up Russian information, so that started to come through and add to what was known already. And the writer talks of the context in which Anthony Blunt decided to become a spy for Russia. And a lot of it was to do with the 1930s, the rise of fascism, which was happening obviously in Germany. People who were like Auden and like Blunt himself actually were in Germany, saw the society changing, saw the attitudes changing, and began to get a sense of what was coming ahead. But fascism was not only in Germany, and that of course tends to be what's talked about in terms of the Second World War, but before that also it had come to power in Italy and also in Spain. And many people who were concerned about that went and fought in Spain, civil war, and died. And Blunt had people he knew and was close to who had died in Spain. So it was quite close to home in a sense, quite close to your heart. And also there had been marches in the late 20s and so forth where there was mass unemployment and people marched the whole length pretty much of the UK to go to the Parliament to say, please give us jobs, we're starving. And then on the other side, Russia had gone through the revolution in 1917 and was claiming that it was supporting people and that they didn't have this class system, and the propaganda that was coming out of Russia was all positive, was very, very positive, and made being communist seem to be a solution to the age-old problem where you had extremely poor people dying and disadvantaged and starving, and rich people who could afford to have proper medical care and eating and heating and good houses and so forth. So that was all in the mix. In fact, there was many people in the 1930s in Cambridge who joined the Communist Party or were around it or were interested in that kind of politics at the time because of the rise of fascism and the social needs that were so obvious in the country. Now, Miranda also says in the prologue that she feels that Anthony Blunt inspired some works of fiction, so you might have come across them in a different form already, that some of Louis MacNeice's characters, obviously the two having shared a study were quite close, and that a character like him was featured in Bridget Brophy's The Finishing Touch, Alan Bennett's A Question of Attribution, and John Banville, The Untouchable. The themes in the book tend to be about friendship, betrayal, politics, concern about fascism. The setting is Britain, upper class, public school with people who are leaders that he's known and mixing with. And the narrative really is why and how someone decides to betray a nation's secrets. And the character of the person was the problem with the book. The book was superbly well researched. Superbly well researched. She took about 6 or 7 years to write the book. And let me just show you the amount of it that are notes. This is the notes in the index. So the book itself is thick. This is the notes at the back in the index. And it's very well written where the notes are all at the back. So if you see something you're interested in on a page, there isn't a huge footnote in most pages. There's some throughout, but the main notes are at the back, and it's up to you to go flick to the back and say, right, page 14, what is this quote? Where did it come from? Or tell me more, and you can find out more. So you can read this book, as I did, without knowing much at all about the Cold War and spying, but yet it will tell you what you need to know. For someone who is keen on that particular area and knows a few of the people already concerned, then this would probably be extremely interesting to you. For me, it was a lot of people that I was not very familiar with in a big, thick book. And unfortunately, a character who's not madly sympathetic. You don't get much from him. He kept other people's letters and he didn't keep his own. There are little scribbled notes that were made much of because that's all they had really to go on. Of course, he didn't keep a detailed diary, and because he's a spy, he's not keen to leave trace of what he's thinking, feeling, or what he's doing on any particular day. So he also managed to be, a lot of people felt that there was this removal, that he was quite a removed personality, and therefore other people found him warm, and because they talked to him about what he was passionate about, which was definitely art. There's no two ways about it. It was a comfort to him in his school growing up, and sent away to boarding school as a young child, like many people of his age and generation. And in that loneliness, he found comfort and interest in art, and it fired him up for the rest of his life. There's a wonderful quote in the book, which is an insight into that system of education. Here it comes. The irony was that the public school system, designed to be a factory for gentlemen, also offered an excellent training in dissidence. It inadvertently fostered a questioning and subversive attitude and a profound distrust of authority, necessary for any intellectual class and vital to the manufacture of an artist, writer, or spy. That's in page 26. And I just want to say that chimed for me with Monty Python. Many of whom were public schoolboys and did have that sense of rebelling against authority. You can see it in their sketches all the time. The authority figure is usually somebody to be subverted or made fun of. So I found it very exciting that Louis MacNeice was his best pal, and that they shared a study together, and reading the book helped me understand MacNeice the poet. And Blunt described MacNeice's, this quote, astonishing visual sensibility, both to paintings, also simply to things seen, colours of the most curious kind. That's on page 36. And of course, Blunt is all about seeing and encourages this because he's into the art. And MacNeice eventually writes him a letter and says, thanks awfully for introducing me to art. The saints send you what you want. So this may all sound quite good, but about halfway through the book, I was absolutely fed up with Blunt. And I went off and read for light interest the biography of a war correspondent, Mary Colvin. I found her a much more interesting character. And how she thought and felt was out there and obvious, and you could warm to her, you could imagine what it would be like to be with her, to meet her, whereas it was really difficult to imagine what it would be like to meet Anthony Blunt. The other reason I got very tired of him halfway through was that his betrayal was quite stomach churning. He had decided to pass on information to Russia. He was part of the British forces in World War II. Excuse me. He was commanding a unit in France, and the Germans were getting closer and closer and closer, and obviously going to overrun the country. And he was busy going around and about and visiting buildings that interested him, and he made no effort to make sure that there were orders given for them to leave France. Eventually somebody else did it, and the life of his unit was saved, but he was making no effort. And the people who had been with him later on and then went on to be led by other people in the Second World War realised how very remiss he was, and that's not something that's easy to warm to. And the other thing is the vast quantity of documents he passed, because he became trusted to be part of MI5, but he was also taking that information and passing it along to the Russians. And he passed over information, including the details of the D-Day landings, which obviously endangered the whole outcome of the war. The only thing, the saving grace in a sense, was that the Russians were overwhelmed by the amount of documents they were receiving from himself, and more importantly Burgess and Philby as well, and they weren't properly attending to all the information that was received and reading it properly. But there were such deep, important information being handed across, where hundreds of thousands of people's lives were at risk, and it's difficult to warm towards somebody who's willing to do that. Then I read a book called Put Out More Flags, which I got, and an Evelyn Waugh book, which was humorous about well brought up guys during the war, and stars somebody who was an absolute guy out on the make. He was not particularly wonderful, but it was light relief. Then I got back to Anthony Blunt, and then for me it started to get interesting, because he began to be involved with the royal family and the art and dealing with the Courtauld. And I really want you to have a look at the picture in the front, because I think it's astonishing. Beautifully taken by Lord Snowdon, but it's an absolutely perfect portrait of this man. He is looking up to art, which is pretty much what he did in his life. It was like a religion to him. He's looking through something, which is film. It's slide, which is a picture of a picture, and he took film of documents later in his career as a spy. Initially didn't want to. He's looking at it quite dispassionately, and there's like a Q almost shaped there. His life was full of questions, and he was a quisling, as you could say. There was a Q in that, but he's slightly removed, looking at something which is a representation of the original, and it's almost like a little window. And he was like that in his life. He was looking at life as if through a window, and the art was what mattered to him. And here he has one eye dominated by a picture of art, and then his other eye seeing reality, and that is how he was. It's also very black and white. It's quite stark. You can't really see his background. He's in the moment and looking and observing, which you could say is part of spying. So I think the cover of the book is a visual indicator, is fantastic. It's incredibly appropriate. Lord Snowdon, of course, was linked to royalty as well through marrying the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret. So that's another little link, the kind of circles that he was moving in. And then there's a picture on the back of him, probably at Cambridge looking very civilised in his suit. And throughout the book, everybody said he had wonderful manners, very good manners, and because of that he was very much liked in the royal circles, the royal household, and in other places as well. It stood well for him. Now, there's a wonderful description about the Courtauld in it, which started out as being a very small institution before it, under his directorship, it began to teach more and more highly regarded courses and attracted people. But there's a wonderful mention of the staff and how it was very much a place where rich young people came to study and to be. They had one case of a Deb kind of female student who came along and said, of course it closes for the season, doesn't it? That was part of her interview for being on the course. But I want to read you a little bit about the librarian and other members of the staff. In the library, Rhoda Welsford, never seen without her gloves, ran her empire like a Mayfair hostess, with fresh flowers every day and young society gales who sorted out the books. Upstairs in the Etruscan room, seated below Cézanne's card players, Johannes Wilde, whose white hair, little round spectacles, and ever-lit cigarette made him look like God emerging from clouds of smoke, communed with his great hero, Michelangelo. Now, isn't that a lovely description? And I must say, Miranda Carter just is brilliant at describing. Not only has she researched this tremendously, spoken to virtually anybody she can, and got snippets. She's an ear for funny quotes, and yet she also describes that scene in a way that makes it interesting and lively, and if you came across it in a novel, you would be interested in the novel. And she's got an interesting line on him. She says he has got a divided life, but she sees it as being divided between the spy and the teacher. That in one, the spy is all about obfuscation and covering up and so on, whereas the teacher, which he was apparently very good at, is all about clarity and making clear and bringing things out to the open. I thought that was a good observation. Now the story takes a turn in 1964 because somebody else confesses their past in spying, and the offer is brought to Blunt that he can confess, and if he tells absolutely everything, he will be given immunity from prosecution, and he agrees. And the rest of his life became very difficult because after that he was interviewed about the past on a monthly basis for 8 years. Almost immediately he develops painful symptoms of stress, and Margaret Thatcher outs him in 1979 publicly. Peter Wright, the person who interviews him repeatedly, felt that Blunt was burdened not by guilt but by trying not to betray the confidences of friends and associates that he had, and basically the information he was giving them were about people they already suspected or else people who died, and he was still, that was his concern, was to keep the confidences. So to sum up, I think this book has historical insights into what boarding school life was like and the generation that was growing up in the 1930s who were faced by this fascism challenge in Europe. It tells you about the Cambridge Spy Circle and the history of the Courtauld School of Art. So if you want a book about a spy in detail, you already know about the Cambridge spies, you're interested in the MI5 and so forth, then you might well enjoy this book. It's superbly written, very well researched, but at the end of the day it's about someone who I found not particularly pleasant, and that was the drawback for me, but well written.